Shabbat Shalom. It's Friday again, and this time it's Parashat Vayishlach. In our parasha, Yaakov is coming back to the land of Israel, and he is meeting his brother, his twin brother, to be precise, Esav. Now, as we know, Yaakov and Esav, Jacob and Esau, did not exactly get along. We see that they are already fighting amongst themselves from when they were still in the womb, and indeed they wrestle their way through life constantly on this back and forth. Who will be the successor? Who will be the firstborn? Who will stay alive? In many ways, we see that Esav is a threat to Yaakov. It's one of the reasons why he had to leave, because he threatened his own life. And now Yaakov is returning back, and he has to face his brother once more. But this time he has a family, and he has all of his wealth that he's brought back. And so he decides that he's going to prepare for the meeting with Esav in three different ways. And the Midrash very beautifully, quoting here Rashi, quoting the Midrash Tanchuma, says that Yaakov decides to meet Esav with three separate different tactics. It says that he decided to meet him, Hitkin atzmo lishlosha dvarim. He decided on these three tactics: Doron, Tfilah, Umilchama. Doron is gifts or diplomacy. Tfilah is prayer. And Milchama is war. Now, we'll see that Yaakov actually puts all three of these different plans into action. He sends gifts to his brother Esav. He sends him a lot of cattle and a lot of animals to try and maybe, oil the wheels. He also prays to Hashem. We see he says, Katonti mikol chasadim umikol ha'emet. Who am I to ask for such a big assistance from God? But nonetheless, says Yaakov, I will request that Hatzileini na miyad achi miyad Esav. Please save me from my brother, from Esav. And finally, we see that he actually prepares himself for war. He splits his family and his camp into two separate bodies, two separate groups. So if one camp is attacked, the other camp will have time to run away and fight back. So these three ideas, diplomacy, prayer, and war, are very important messages that we learn here of how to deal with an adversary such as Esav. And I think it's very interesting. Today, we really see all three of these different pathways put into practice in our day-to-day lives. Unfortunately, we're still at war. We're still fighting our enemies. And we see, obviously, there is the element of the actual war, going to war, fighting in the war, serving in the army, serving on the front lines, sending our planes to bomb and to defend, and so on and so forth. But the other two parts are also very, very important. There's the importance of tefillah, and there's the importance of diplomacy. Indeed, we find today that in many communities, we still pray daily for the success of our troops, for the return of the hostages. And we find around the world Jewish communities involved in actions of coming together as a community, of praying, of studying, of trying to, be activists, both in our world and in the heavenly world, to try and intercede on behalf of the Jewish people. We say, Hatzileini na, please save us. Ana Hashem hatzlichana, please Hashem help us. Ana Hashem hoshiana, please redeem us, please help us, save us. And yet the third part is also fascinating. And I think this is a part which sometimes in Judaism we kind of forget. We're used to the fight or flight, to the fight or prayer, but we sometimes forget there is a value to Doron, to diplomacy, to, in many ways, maybe an element of back and forth, of economic sanctions, or the opposite, economic incentives. There is an element of maybe even bribery at some stages, which is, to a certain degree, diplomacy can look like sometimes. When we send our emissaries, our messengers, our Vayishlach Yaakov lefanav malachim, when we send our servants, our messengers, our people, our ambassadors to go and talk to our enemies, whether they're enemies in Syria, whether they're enemies in Iran, or whether they're enemies in Hamas. When we are doing this back and forth of we'll give you a few days of ceasefire and you'll give us a bunch of hostages and so on and so forth. That is also seemingly part of this story. Now, it's very complex, as all of these important issues are. What should be done? What is the moral thing to be done? What is the correct security thing to be done? Leave that to the experts. But I think it's important that we recognize all three of these different parts. Both the army and the diplomats and the rabbis are all integral parts of the fight against anti-Semitism. And if this is true in Israel, with its very, very clear enemies, I think this is also true for anti-Semitism around the world. The way to combat anti-Semitism must always come through three means. The first mean is activism. We need to fight it. Fight it in the courts, fight it in the press. We need to go out there and lobby politicians and make a fuss and call the police and make sure that we can really stand up for what we believe in. Be courageous, going to war, info wars against the information that is, the libels that are spread about us. But the second part is also very important. Tefillah. We have to pray, and we have to, in this case, strengthen our Jewish identity, our religious identity. If you are involved in a place which is saying you are a Jew and we hate you for it, then the answer is, well, then come back and figure out what does it mean to be a Jew, and defend that, but defend that from a place of knowledge, not a place of ignorance. Defend that from a place of connection to the Jewish past, to the Jewish future, to the Jewish ideal, to the Jewish purpose. Connect to Hashem, connect to God, connect to the idea of why did God choose the Jews. That is something that we need to come back to tefillah. We need to recognize that at the end of the day, it's not just the police forces of the world that will maybe come to help us. We also need divine intervention. Hashem is the person at the end of the day, the entity at the end of the day, who will support us and will save us and redeem us. And finally, there's the idea of diplomacy. Diplomacy is also a very important element of interfaith interaction. We need to also be able to persuade. We need to be a kiddush Hashem. We need to be a light unto the nations. We need to be able to talk peacefully and calmly and interact with those who will maybe be our allies, to try and even talk to our enemies and find common ground and try and in many ways persuade them that we are not as big of a threat as they perceive. Not always easy, but definitely very important. If we take all three of these, tefillah, milchama, and doron, Jewish identity, activism, fighting the fight, and diplomacy, trying to win people to our side, I think that will be in many ways a continuation of the message of our forefather Yaakov, and we will be able to bring our parsha to life in this very day and age. Shabbat Shalom.